Tomorrow is the commemoration of another genocide. April 24th is Armenian Genocide Remembrance Day, which makes us even more honored that our next speaker, Alex Galitsky, took the time today to come to our conference and speak with Induji. Alex Galitsky is the Communications Director of the Armenian National Committee of America, Western Region. In his role, Galitsky oversees the organization's communications, strategy, public relations, and media outreach. He also leads the Impact Media Institute, an upcoming initiative aimed at combating and confronting genocide denial in the world today. Alex Galitsky was born and raised in Australia, graduating from the University of Sydney with a Bachelor of Political, Economic, and Social Sciences with first-class honors in Government Affairs and International Relations. Prior to joining the ANCA, Galitsky worked across a range of fields in the space of government relations, community outreach, and human rights research. He has previously worked at the Armenian National Committee of Australia, specializing in government relations, as well as for a member of the Australian Federal Parliament, working in the space of community outreach. Alex, take it away.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure and an honor, a privilege to be here today. And I have to say, on behalf of the Armenian National Committee of America and on behalf of the entire Armenian American community, we stand in solidarity with the Hindu community in the United States. We released a statement on the Hindu-Bengali Genocide Commemoration Day a couple of weeks ago, and watching that video just then was absolutely heart-wrenching. It's such an emotional time for our community as we approach the 106th anniversary commemoration of the Armenian Genocide. We know what it's like to have our voices unheard, our history erased, our genocide denied, and I think between us and you all here, there is a profound bond of solidarity that I hope to be able to explore more today in this discussion.
Absolutely. Thank you, Alex, for those kind words. And again, I just echo what Krishna said earlier. We're so grateful that on these hectic days, I know it's been very hectic for you this week, that you took the time to be with us. The last time we spoke, you told me a little bit about your journey, how you came to be an Armenian Australian living in the United States. So I thought maybe we could take a step back and you could tell us a little bit about your personal journey, how you came to the US, what work you do, what does it look like? And what does ANCA do in general?
Absolutely. And I don't want to labor on myself because we're a movement of not of individuals, but of activists and organizations. But I think from what I can say, I think as an Armenian, growing up Armenian, there is a consciousness of genocide that we all live with, an understanding of genocide that we all live with. None of us live in the countries that we do today by choice. We are here as a result of a process of forced displacement because our homeland was occupied, our people killed, and what remained was nothing. The Ottoman Empire exterminated 75 to 80% of the Armenian population. And then shortly after that, the Soviets came in and took over what remained of our homeland. Many scattered to the United States, to many more scattered throughout the Middle East, where the nations there took in Armenian refugees and provided them refuge for many years until, of course, the period of destabilization during the 70s and 80s that forced them to flee again for their lives. So the experience of Armenians is one of constant displacement, disruption, dispossession. And that's how we find ourselves in diaspora. We all have our own unique stories as to how we came here, but the thread of genocide across our history is definitely one that is very pertinent to us. It's one that we're exposed to from a very young age. It's one that we still certainly experience and feel the trauma of because of the fact that for so long that genocide has been denied and gone unrecognized. In Australia, we have a small but very fierce Armenian community, one that has been incredibly politically active. In fact, the premier of my state is in fact Armenian and herself a survivor of genocide descendant of genocide survivors. And it's something that I think from within our bones, this history of genocide imbues us with a sense of the need to rectify this injustice that our community has been subject to. I think there's a great sense of duty and passion within every single one of us to see that injustice rectified. And that's what brought me into the space of advocacy myself, particularly in 2016, when we saw Azerbaijan first at a very, very large scale try to take over through force ancestral Armenian lands, which to many of us was seen as a continuation of this process of genocide. And I'll have more to say about this later, because we've seen a very unfortunate development in the last year with this on this front. But I think something that many, and that video certainly elucidated for me, is that there is always this process of continuity of genocide from the period of perpetration to the present day when there is denial. And that denial that exists is what drives us to seek that justice. And as I mentioned, we have a scattered community as a result of the dispossession and displacement we've experienced. And I found my way to Los Angeles because that is in many ways, heart of the Armenian diaspora. For maybe some inexplicable reason, Armenians flocked to Los Angeles in the wake of the genocide and in the years after that, to the point at which LA is now the most Armenian populous city in the world after Yerevan, the capital of Armenia. About 500,000 Armenians by conservative estimates in LA, a further million spread throughout California, and maybe 1.5 million in the United States as a whole. So coming to a place like LA, you see this incredible sort of, it's hard to even describe what it is. It's almost like you've walked straight into another world, into Armenia, where most of the people around you in a place like Glendale, where I currently am in our offices, speak Armenian, where the store signs, storefronts are Armenian, where the predominant cuisine is Armenian. It's a very interesting sort of capsule of Armenian existence located in the heart of LA. And it's a place where Armenians have been able to activate themselves politically, socially, culturally, economically, in a way that really took off. In some ways, a renaissance for our community after the experience of genocide and dispossession. LA is home to Armenian members of city council, of the assembly, historically in the Senate. Even a governor of California was Armenian. We have Armenians in news journalism. And there is a really great sense of community and openness within the LA environment to this important piece of heritage, the Armenian community story here in Los Angeles. So that's sort of what drew me here. I think one thing that I'm certainly proud of is the level of activism and advocacy that happens in a place like LA because of the size of our community and this sense of like passion and striving for justice that exists within our community and in our mentality, our psyche as Armenians. The single largest protest in the history of Los Angeles was in 2015 on the 100-year anniversary of the Armenian Genocide, where over 150,000 Armenian Americans took to the streets of LA to march on the Turkish Consulate General to demand that Turkey recognize the genocide and that the US government stop enforcing the denial of the genocide by Turkey. So this is the kind of environment that we're in. And just to kind of contemporize this a little bit, we are now in the midst of what might be US recognition of the genocide tomorrow. Every indication seems to be pointing towards that. And I'm incredibly overwhelmed by emotionally, not to mention physically, with all of the interviews and everything that's been happening for a day that our community has been fighting for so long. It has just been, I think, a tumultuous period for us, because denial, and I know that Hindu Americans and Hindus across the world will understand this, that denial of a trauma is to reinforce that trauma, right? When you were told that the crime that was perpetrated against your people was not a crime, that it didn't happen, that these people perhaps miraculously vanished from the face of existence to no fault of anyone or any force, how are we to mourn? How are we to move on? How are those wounds meant to heal? It's impossible. And we have carried that burden for such a long time. And we owe it to our forebears to see this through and to see this recognized. And it's a testament to the work of the generations of tireless advocacy, the resolute determination from people who have faced defeat after defeat. I can't even begin to express how many times our community has been promised recognition, been promised justice, only to see those things fall flat on their face. So that's kind of to paint a picture, I guess, just to do a little bit of background on the ANC. Our organization, the Armenian National Committee of America, is the largest Armenian American grassroots advocacy organization in the country. We operate a system of organizations. We have a DC office, an Eastern region office based in Boston, and our Western region offices, where I represent here in Los Angeles. We were founded in its original form in 1918, so immediately after the genocide, by Armenian American activists and immigrants, people who were themselves refugees from the genocide, who felt the need to campaign for not only the assistance to be provided to Armenians who are experiencing persecution, but also to ensure an independent Armenian homeland in the face of the existential threats that our people posed. In its current form, our organization has existed since 1940, and throughout that period of time, activism has varied in many different forms, whether it be providing humanitarian assistance to Armenia, raising awareness of the plight of the Armenians under Soviet rule, supporting our Armenian communities throughout the Middle East, humanitarian assistance to those communities, to, of course, genocide recognition, which especially in the last 50 or 60 years has become one of the most important priorities of our organization. We operate within our regional structure a series of local chapters, in our region, about a dozen local ANCA chapters and activists who do tireless volunteer work to reach out to their local representatives, Congress members, whoever it might be, to advocate for the interests of our community. And that can be anything from the recognition of the genocide to education for the genocide in school curriculums, or humanitarian aid to Armenia and to Armenia's sister state Artsakh, and to a range of initiatives. Even at a very localized level, we have affiliated youth organizations and humanitarian organizations that have worked to help vaccinate our community during COVID, to provide humanitarian assistance to our community during COVID as well, including food drives. We run voter outreach campaigns to get people involved in the political process. We helped coordinate the census campaign here to get our people counted. So there's a lot of different forms activism take to keep our community engaged and motivated. But I think at its core, we are a movement that is grounded in the basic principles and tenets of international human rights. That is, we want to see the genocide recognized. We want to see every genocide occurring in the world today recognized. We want to prevent future genocides from happening. And I'll get into this when I describe the genocide a little bit more, to give a bit more historic background. I understand I kind of live in a bubble where it's almost innocuous to say the word Armenian genocide, but there is still a lot that people may not understand about it. We also stand for self-determination, the right to self-determination. Our communities in our ancestral lands today still face the threat of destruction. And the only way that we see we can ensure their security and their livelihood is through the legitimate right to self-determination that they are owed under international law. And it's interesting, and as I take you through this kind of journey of how the history has unfolded, you'll see that so much of what the Armenian people have experienced actually served at the foundations for a lot of the basic principles of international law we take for granted today. The most tragic part of this is that even though Armenians were at the heart of the effort to have a genocide convention established and to institutionalize self-determination within the confines of international law, Armenians have been repeatedly denied those very rights to this day. So I guess I'll, on that perhaps depressing note, turn it back to you, Indu, and let us continue.
Sure, thank you for that. I mean, I think first of all, I'm just grateful for the education. And also, I think it really resonates with what a lot of the things we've been talking about today in terms of really facing painful histories. And as you know, and as we've talked about, Hindus have experienced layer upon layer of genocide, and to survive almost, I think there has been a lot of internal denial. And so the passing along of that history, that intergenerational knowledge of genocide, I think is something that we need to work a little bit more on. Something that I'm really curious about, because we have the benefit of you not being an American, is I wonder how, when your genocide and your persecution is not recognized, how is your advocacy perceived and received? And maybe also, do you find any particular intonations in the United States that are specific to the US?
This is a very important question, because there is this almost like this duality in the experience of advocacy for the genocide and it is actually common across my experience in Australia and the US, although in different ways. But to focus on the US, I've never come across a representative at a federal level, at a state level, local level, who was ever outright denied to our face that a genocide took place. There is this understanding through a historical lens that what happened was genocide. The difficulty comes then when you try to take it from understanding and education to actual policy of recognizing the genocide. And that's where you start to see the input of the sorts of, I guess you could call it gaslighting in a way, but we're told that the relationship between the United States and Turkey is so important to US national security that taking the step to recognize this historic injustice would do incalculable damage to the US-Turkey relationship, and therefore it's not worth the risk to recognize the genocide. So we are at the same time being told it happened, but then have that denied straight to our face. And there are interesting ways in which the US goes about this process of denial. For example, President Barack Obama, when he was a candidate, said that he would recognize the genocide. It was a campaign promise that he had made. Very soon after assuming office, when his first April 24th commemoration did not use the term genocide. He used the term Medziyeher, which in Armenian means the great crime. It's a term we use colloquially to refer to the genocide. But the genocide term is grounded in an history of international law. It has a legal meaning, it has a legal definition, and within that also has a sort of impetus for action to enact or to enforce this determination that a genocide took place. So using a substitute term instead of the word genocide is trying to signal to our community, we get it, we understand that a genocide took place, but at the same time, be able to tell Turkey, but look, we didn't call it a genocide, therefore we try to please both sides. But it doesn't work that way, because Turkey denies that use of the term genocide. It denies not only that these massacres took place in a way that was designed to exterminate a population, which is what genocide means. They, in some instances, even say that the Armenians had it coming, and they deny any sort of criminality in their act. When you deny that this thing that took place is a crime, you're effectively saying there is some way of justifying it took place. So that's why the term genocide has specific meaning to our community. And that's why the way we've seen it manifest here is sort of like a human rights is a commodity that can be bartered away with Turkey for the sake of geopolitical expediency. That is something that we, not only feel strongly about as Armenians, but I would think that if the United States is a country that proclaims to stand on these principles of international human rights and justice and democracy and all these things, that they wouldn't be afraid to speak up about the genocide, that they would be willing to hold Turkey to account, that the benefits of partnership with the United States and Turkey should not be that the US gets to grant total impunity to Turkey, that Turkey thinks that it can get away with this crime of genocide. So we've seen this, not to just single out President Obama. It's been a process over successive administrations on both sides of the political aisle to enforce Turkey's denial. It's almost always rooted in some sort of national security argument, and it's almost always instigated by the Turkish side. Turkey, and I'm sure we'll explore this a little bit more later as well, but Turkey invests a phenomenal amount of state resources into the official denial of the genocide. Not only are they intent on erasing the history of the Armenians within their own domestic population, they also feel the need to enforce that denial at an international stage, to the point at which they have invested millions of dollars into paying for academic positions or journalistic placements, or these sorts of like public influence and public diplomacy outlets where they can try and control or steer the narrative, either overtly denying the genocide or trying to legitimize this narrative that the US should put genocide recognition on the back burner lest it fear losing its relationship with Turkey. In other cases, there are diplomatic missions. In some diplomatic missions are almost single-mindedly focused on denial of the Armenian genocide. And I have a very interesting personal story about this as well that I'll get into. And then at a presidential executive level in Turkey, just last year, the Turkish government said that one of its major priorities is to counter and combat the Armenian lobby. So, I take a lot of pride that President Erdogan thinks are such a threat that he has to spend state resources at an executive level to combat our rinky-dink operation here of community activists and grassroots advocates. But on a serious note, the way in which Turkey presents and conceptualizes of this big bad Armenian lobby is very, very similar to the way in which we see other forms of racism and xenophobia manifest, particularly when it comes to anti-Semitism. There are a lot of very close parallels between the sorts of rhetoric and narrative, and I'm sure also when it comes to Hinduphobia, the way in which this sort of question of dual loyalty comes up, or that there might be some sort of malign global conspiracy of wealthy business people and activists and lobbyists who are they're out to get Turkey, or they're out to get Pakistan, or whatever it might be. There's just this sense of global conspiracy to undermine the state. And that's not what it is. I mean, we as a community are seeking justice, seeking the ability for us to truly mourn those lives that were lost. But then also in a contemporary context, the ramifications of the denial of genocide are fueling crimes against our populations to this day. And as a result, what we need to do is ensure recognition is done as a first step to prevent those crimes from taking place. Because if you can't diagnose what the illness is, how are you going to be able to find the cure, right? So that's to give a sense of the type of attitudes we face here. In Australia, it was very, very similar, except that Australia not being a NATO member, not being part of this global security architecture, had a more symbolic reason for why it refused to recognize the genocide. And in my opinion, an even more cynical reason, which was during the First World War, Australian soldiers invaded the Ottoman Empire. They stormed the shores of Gallipoli, and many Australian men died on the field of battle. Tens of thousands died on the field of battle. In the years after the war ended, the Turkish Republic, after the Ottoman Empire fell, their leaders tried to concoct this mythology where the Australians and the Turks died on the same field of battle. The memories of our heroes are bonded together on the bloody soil, and they set up a memorial for the Australian soldiers in Gallipoli in Turkey. So Turkey now threatens every single year, if you recognize the genocide, we will deny you the right to go and visit the bodies of your soldiers and pay them respect. So it's not only a denial of the genocide, but it's a threat to deny the memory of the Australians who suffered as a result of the genocide, and made all the more atrocious by the fact that Australian soldiers who died in the Ottoman front had actually witnessed the genocide and were amongst the first eyewitness respondents. The first testimonies of the genocide taking place were from Australian soldiers who were there, who were witnessing the roundups and massacres. So, and even in the United States, one thing that we always feel the need to stress as a point of gratitude is that the United States, the first major international humanitarian relief effort of its kind anywhere in the world, was organized in the US with the support of the US government to support the refugees from Armenia, to house the hundreds of thousands of orphans from the Armenian Genocide, to provide material support and humanitarian assistance to the survivors of the genocide, to the tune of about $2 billion in today's money, raised at the time. New York Times, LA Times, papers across the country were reporting on the destruction of a nation. And you need to understand that back then the term genocide didn't exist yet. So they were finding ways to describe the intentional destruction of an entire people in their reporting. People knew about it back then. But between 1915 and 1918 to today, that memory has been not only forgotten, it's been intentionally erased by the government and by successive administrations and by different forces trying to express their malign influence over US foreign policy to prevent us from even acknowledging this very proud chapter in American history. So it's a huge entanglement of all these different forces, competing interests, very cynical competing interests that's brought us to this point.
Yeah, well, first of all, I feel like I'm nodding so much that my head might fall off of its neck. And I imagine hundreds of people watching have been nodding and really relating to what you're saying, because so many of the dynamics that you describe are painfully relatable. As you were describing the selective recognition or selective morality and the sort of circuits of power and influence and money and knowledge production that sustain that. That just the idea of like morality as a form of currency kind of came to mind. Like it is something that's traded and held and reserved and all these things. It's wild. And the other term that came to mind to me was just moral injury. So this concept of taking an action that goes against your own, either your own perceived sense of yourself about what is moral, and what happens when people are morally injured, or institutions or countries or governments, people can tend to double down on the injury because otherwise they have to face the fact that they've violated. So maybe that's a more hopeful take than moral currency. And maybe we can sit somewhere in between those two. But absolutely everything that you're describing is very, very relatable. I think one of the things that I'm hearing from you is recognition, and a huge part of recognition is just really understanding the facts. And so while I don't expect you to summarize the entire history, maybe what are the most important things for people here today to really understand about the Armenian Genocide?
What I'll try to do, and because it's very, very difficult to distill, I do want to go through a sort of timeline, not even timeline, but just maybe a narrative, just to give you a sense of what took place, and hopefully in a way that is easy to follow and not too kind of heavy on the history and the hard history of it. But it goes without saying that when we use terms like genocide, or when we describe historical periods like the genocide, which we define as 1915 to 1923, it's never the whole story. It's never encapsulating the entire systemic process that lies behind genocide, because genocide isn't just an act. It is a process. It's a systemic, institutionalized phenomenon that is coordinated, carefully planned, and conducted over the course of generations. It's not something that simply, turns on overnight and suddenly a government says, we're going to eradicate this population. In order to do that, you need this systemic foundation, right? You need to convince your population that these people are subhuman and that you can perpetrate violence against them without any sort of consequence. So when we talk about the onset of the Armenian Genocide, it's really not 1915 we should be looking at. It should be hundreds of years before that point, when the Ottoman Empire was established, a Muslim empire, which really isn't particularly relevant, aside from the fact that Armenians, as a Christian nation that had inhabited this region of the world for thousands and thousands of years. We're talking about Armenian identity and culture tracing back to 2000 BC, maybe even before that, depending on how you define the continuity of ethnicity and identity, but we'll say safely around that. So 3,000 or so years into the history of this nation, you have a foreign force come in, establish imperial rule, foreign imperial rule, that subjugated a people, the Armenian Christians, to a government that they did not consent to tax systems that they did not consent to, that punished them specifically for their identity, policies of assimilation and massacre and extermination that existed in a period where we didn't even document history, from the 1400s to the 1800s, where these things were just happening, but perhaps not seen through this thread of genocide. But we understand that there was this persecution of non-Muslim, specifically non-Turkic minorities under Ottoman rule for a very long time, and that Armenians bore the brunt of that because they were consistent with a large population in that region before the Ottoman domination, and that population steadily declined over hundreds of years. In the 1890s, this sort of reached a boiling point because the Ottoman Empire was in its sort of dying days. The Greeks had separated in the early 1800s. There were wars in the Balkans to separate from the Ottoman Empire. And there was a great sense of paranoia on the Ottoman leadership front that the Armenians were about to try and separate themselves from the Ottomans and undermine the integrity of the empire, fueled by nothing but paranoia and conspiracies that saw the Armenians as having a sort of dual loyalty, that Armenians were not citizens but subjects, that posed an internal threat. So in the 1890s, there was this period we call the Hamidyan Massacres, or Sultan Hamid of the Ottoman Empire killed 500,000 Armenians between 1890 and 1895. Not long after that, there were the Adana Massacres, where several tens of thousands of Armenians were killed. And then in 1915 began this process of systematic extermination where 1.5 million Armenians were killed. 1.5 million, I think I mentioned, being about 70 to 80% of the population of the Armenian population of the Ottoman Empire at the time. In addition to another million Greeks and Assyrians and other Christian minorities. So all in all, about 3 million Christian subjects of the Ottoman Empire were exterminated in this deliberate policy of extermination in a 5 to 7 year period. Specifically, actually, in that early 1915 to 1916 era. There are documents that detail the leaders of the Ottoman Empire issuing writs that we must deport and exterminate these people. The first act, and why we commemorate April 24th specifically, is when that is when the Ottoman Empire began the systematic roundup of Armenian intellectuals and other community leaders. Hundreds of them, rounded them up, imprisoned them, and subsequently executed them. Religious leaders, political leaders, all sorts of philosophers, musicians, anyone who had any influence in Armenian society, any bearing in Armenian society was targeted, because you cut the head off the snake, then it's easier for you to engage in the destruction of the rest of that community. So the genocide took place in numerous forms that I think will unfortunately sound very familiar to those who are students of history. There were wholesale massacres of Armenian populations by Ottoman forces and Kurdish irregulars that were enlisted by the Ottomans to persecute and destroy the Armenian people. And then there were large death marches through the Syrian desert of Deir Zor, where hundreds of thousands of Armenians were marched without food, water, any sort of subsistence, medical supplies, anything like that, to the point in which they died. It was a deliberate policy of extermination through privation. There were also cases of systematic rape, where Armenian women were subject to disgusting abuses by Ottoman forces, with the intention of having the children of that crime be part of the Ottoman identity, or the Turkish, to breed the Armenian out of these children, in effect. And then in another kind of aspect of this gender-based violence was the abduction of children from families to place them under Turkish families, where they would be converted to Islam, have their Armenian identity stripped from them, and raised as if they had never had any contact with their Armenian identity whatsoever. And this is how that process continued. So while there was 1.5 million people who died as a result of this, there were countless others who would have been subject to this systematic rape or the removal from families. That meant the genocide took place in both a physical and cultural way. Even outside of the extermination of the physical extermination, it was a spiritual extermination. It was a identity-based extermination, cultural extermination. Alongside all of this, Armenian churches and cultural sites were destroyed, their cities burnt to the ground, depopulated, some churches converted into mosques. And that process actually continued well after the defined period of genocide, 1915 to 1923. It continues to this day, in fact. But that is it's very saddening and depressing to explain, but I think it's important to understand the extent to which this occurred. But I also want to bring in a sort of international dimension to this, which is, as I mentioned, Americans were very aware of what was taking place. It was reported very early on during this process of destruction what was taking place. And one of the main sources of information was actually the US ambassador to the Ottoman Empire at the time, Henry Morgenthau. And Henry Morgenthau actually brought to one of the key architects of genocide, Talat Pasha. He told him to stop this persecution, to end this persecution. He organized what he could to try and help Armenians escape, and was a strong advocate for the Armenians as a US government representative in Turkey. Of course, his calls largely fell on deaf ears. There were other rescue efforts by the US, by the French during the time, but this is just to say that there was a great sense of understanding, a degree of understanding of what was going on. Just perhaps a lack of ability to fully prevent it, because the US at the time had made a decision not to intervene in the First World War, which is when this crime occurred. And that dimension of it is very important as well, because the Turkish government will say to this day that it wasn't a genocide, it was a product of war. The World War was happening at the time, and Armenians were fighting for their resistance, and as a result died. I mean, I don't know how 1.5 million people can be killed just in the course of a war. It can only happen if one side is deliberately being targeted, if they are not armed, if they're civilians, for example, and not combatants, which is exactly what was happening. But I make this point because right after the war ended, Woodrow Wilson, president of the US, who was keenly attuned to the suffering the Armenians were facing, sought to institutionalize these concepts of international human rights law in a way that would prevent what happened to the Armenians from happening again. These are his 14 points for those who are aware of the diplomatic history of the US, and the establishment of the League of Nations, which was a sort of precursor to the United Nations. And in that, he actually advocated very strongly for an independent Armenia as a sort of restitution for the suffering that they had experienced at the hands of the Ottoman Empire. And that was successful, only for 2 years, because the Soviets then came through and railroaded those efforts. But for those 2 years, the United States actually recognized an independent Armenian state and established for the first time in international law a sort of process of remedial secession for persecuted communities to find a way in which they can escape the injustices inflicted upon them through self-rule. This was very important because world powers also then decided to go through a process of tribunals for the perpetrators of the genocide. We call them the triumvirate of the Ottoman leadership: Cemal Pasha, Talat Pasha, and Enver Pasha. And these guys were all charged with the intentional destruction of the Armenian community. This is before the Nuremberg trials, before genocide was even a term in common parlance. They were all sentenced to death in absentia because they had all fled from the Ottoman Empire to Malta or to elsewhere in Europe. And then kind of we enter this period in which I think it's perhaps one of the most critical eras in the development of a modern day sort of structure or concept of the crime of genocide, because some Armenians who had been themselves the victims of genocide in that they'd lost family members took it upon themselves to enact those sentences that were handed down through a campaign of just vengeance, a righteous vengeance. And one of the most important of these was the assassination of Talat Pasha, the chief architect of the Armenian Genocide in Berlin in 1921. And he was I would say transparent about his crime. He was sentenced in a trial, but ultimately acquitted of any wrongdoing. And it was a landmark case because what had happened in that trial was, instead of putting this man who assassinated a genocide perpetrator on the stand, the trial became about the perpetrator of the genocide. And it became a way to expose the crimes of this man who had perpetrated one of the most heinous crimes. And it captured the intention of a very, very important individual called Raphael Lemkin. And Raphael Lemkin was a Polish Jewish lawyer at the time who was observing this trial take place. And it struck him as absurd that there was a crime to describe what this man had done as murder, the murder of one individual. But there was not a crime to describe what the victim of this assassination attempt had done, which was genocide. This man would be put on trial for murdering an individual who murdered an entire nation. But the man who was killed there was no legal recourse to see what he had done be punished and prosecuted, and for some sort of justice for the victims of that crime that he had organized and helped perpetrate. And that began a journey for Raphael Lemkin to create a definition of genocide that he would also feel very personally, as a Jew living in Europe who saw his entire family killed, that there was a need for this term. And he then worked and advocated tirelessly for many, many years until the legal definition of genocide was adopted by the UN in 1948, the UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, which laid out some very, very distinct and clear conditions for which a crime becomes genocide: the intentional killing of a people in whole or in part, in accordance with these conditions of physical extermination, death by privation, the removal of children from families and placed under the care of another, all these sorts of these manifestations of the crime of genocide that he had put into effect in the international arena of the UN as a result of what he had witnessed in terms of the trial of the genocide, and then later the injustices that he saw the Armenian people subject to. This was a critical moment, a watershed moment in the development of the international legal framework of what we see as atrocity prevention to this day. But like I said, Armenians have been denied the right to have their own genocide defined by the terms that were created in response to the genocide that was perpetrated against them. And I think there's no better articulation of the costs of impunity in this case than the fact that Hitler, at one of his addresses to his generals before invading Poland and commencing the Holocaust, had said, "Who, after all, speaks today of the annihilation of the Armenian people?" An absolutely grueling representation of how impunity for years leads to the repetition of that crime. And in many ways, we see what Turkey did, and the impunity that it has been afforded by the international community for so long has served as a blueprint for how many other authoritarian and tyrannical regimes have conducted genocide to this day, while the international community watches on in silence. We can't forget the complicity of the US government and the UK in what happened to the Hindus during the Hindu Bengali genocide. That their willful ignorance to the conditions that were taking place led to an extreme situation of persecution. What happened in Rwanda was entirely preventable, but the United States chose not to intervene because it did not want to put its own people at risk after it had faced the backlash of its intervention in Somalia. It's always a calculation grounded in self-interest and self-preservation that prevents world powers from doing the right thing by people who are experiencing persecution to this day. And for the Armenian people, that process never ended. 106 years later, Armenians are still being persecuted in Turkey. They're still being persecuted in their ancestral lands by Azerbaijan and by the Turkish government. I know, I'm sorry, I don't want to be a burden on time at all, but if I can go into this very quickly without going into the history, because it is also a very complex story that is hard to weave. But Armenians in this region of Nagorno-Karabakh, which is an ethnic Armenian majority area that adjacent to the Republic of Armenia today, that was unlawfully separated from the Armenian Republic by Stalin 100 years ago, almost 100 years ago now, has been under constant assault by Azerbaijan and with the explicit backing of Turkey. There was a war last year that Azerbaijan initiated to try and capture that territory. The Armenians had, in 1991, declared their independence and had been self-governing that region of Armenia for 3 decades. It was a democracy, in fact, a democracy considered far more free and far more equitable than Azerbaijan was. And you can understand why the Armenians wouldn't want to live under the rule of a tyrannical, authoritarian, corrupt regime like that of Azerbaijan, which is very much akin to Turkey, and has a lot of sympathies with Pakistan and other. I mean, it kind of ranks in the same sphere as a North Korea or a China in terms of the freedoms that the people are denied there. Azerbaijan invaded this area last year with the support of Turkey. And as a result of that, displaced 100,000 people. Hundreds of people still remain captive as prisoners of war, where Human Rights Watch has noted they are experiencing torture, not just any old mistreatment and abuse, physical torture. There was a use of chemical weapons against these populations, the constant shelling of civilian populations, and now, after the war ended, which resulted in Azerbaijan capturing these territories, occupying these territories by force, the Armenian heritage sites, ancient churches dating back to the beginning of Christianity, now suffering the threat of destruction by Azerbaijan, which has undertaken a concerted effort for many years now to destroy Armenian cultural heritage sites. Over the top of all this is this policy of institutionalized dehumanization of Armenians by the Azerbaijani government. Armenians are considered subhuman. They're considered the enemies of the state. Azerbaijan has incited heinous crimes against Armenians everywhere. There was a case of an Azerbaijani soldier beheading an Armenian during a peacetime NATO training program. And when he was charged and convicted in Hungary, where the training program took place, later extradited to Azerbaijan. And as soon as he arrived in Azerbaijan, he was given a presidential pardon. He was given a national honor. He was given back pay for the time he served in prison for the crime of murder, and elevated to the position of national hero in the Azerbaijani consciousness. More recently, the incitement of violence against Armenians by Azerbaijan has actually hit our communities here. Our organization, the ANCA, one of our offices in San Francisco was actually burnt down last year in a racially motivated arson attack. Our school in San Francisco was shot at, and that same school was actually vandalized with horrific anti-Armenian, pro-Azerbaijani material that are all being investigated as hate crimes to this day. In fact, there have been a number of these sorts of incidents, but that's probably the most recent one and the most horrific one. Just 2 weeks ago, Azerbaijan opened an exhibit in Azerbaijan of the helmets of Armenian soldiers, stripped from the bodies of soldiers. They paired with these grotesque wax caricatures of Armenians dying or Armenians being taken captive, open to the public. And there have been photos circulating of Azerbaijani children pretending to kill these soldiers in the weapons that were confiscated and taken by Azerbaijan from Armenia. Children reenacting the killing of Armenians at this grotesque genocide theme park. Absolutely absurd. But this is the sort of environment that we're dealing with here in terms of how, when you allow an ideology of denial to take root in a community and you fail to learn from your history and take seriously the lessons of history, that you can create an environment in the country today where people are prepared to do things like that and are prepared to see an entire nation dehumanized and even incite violence, genocidal violence against the community. And I think the best way to kind of tie these two things together, and why we say that the genocide never ended and continues to this day, is because when Turkey's president went to Azerbaijan after the war ended in November, and he was at a victory parade in the capital Baku, he praised Enver Pasha, one of the architects of the genocide. He publicly honored the memory of a genocide perpetrator in front of a crowd of people, adoring people, right after a war with the same country they had perpetrated genocide against had lost. And if that wasn't enough, the war itself coincided with the 100th anniversary of Turkey's invasion of the First Republic of Armenia, which was the consummation of the genocide that began in 1915. There are all of these historic parallels that exist between these two cases, and they're incredibly complex issues in history that make it very hard for us to convey this to audiences in the US that aren't familiar with the depths of these histories, right? So when we explain this to media, another manifestation of denial or this gaslighting, Armenophobia as well, as we call it, is this false equivalency between these two sides. And the personal story I wanted to share actually was yesterday I was doing an interview with the local CBS station here, and the reporter said, I have a comment from the Turkish Consul General in LA. Let me read it to you. And he read to me a statement that outright denied the Armenian genocide. And he told me, I'm going to be airing this. Would you like to respond? And I told him there is absolutely no way I'm going to respond to, I'm not going to dignify genocide denial with a response. I'm not going to stand here as a representative of my community and engage in a debate over an issue where there is no debate. There is no debate because this is an historic fact. It's a widely accepted historic fact that genocide took place, right? So when you try to elevate denial to the same level of historic fact, that is a hugely irresponsible thing to do. That sets a very dangerous precedent for other communities in the world today experiencing genocide. And I say that because all of these things are interconnected. If Turkey was not allowed to get away with the denial and perpetrated genocide for so long, who's to say whether or not the genocides we've seen in the years since would have actually taken place, because the world might have had a much more mature response to what is happening. But I can't imagine, for example, how an Uyghur American who has escaped persecution in China must feel when these media platforms provide Chinese government officials the opportunity to deny the genocide that's taking place today on television by giving them the same platform as people experiencing persecution to make their case, as if there is a case at all in which the perpetration of genocide could be justified or should be given a platform. So I told this reporter, you can not quote me on this. You can read out a disclaimer that says the ANCA will not entertain denialism of this well-known historic fact. And despite my pleas and my petitions to the station, the network, they still ran the segment. They still ran the statement of the Turkish Consul General. And that is not an isolated incident. It happens all the time. In reporting even on the recent news that Biden might be recognizing the genocide tomorrow, outlets like CNN and Reuters, some of the biggest news outlets in the world, would refer to the Armenian Genocide in quotation marks, genocide, as if there's some kind of debate. Or they would refer it to the claim of genocide, as if it's a claim that we're making that could be disputed. So this is a sort of the challenges that we still face to this day, despite the decades of advocacy our community has undertaken to ensure that these crimes are rightfully recognized for what they are. And the reason behind why these myths and these denialist claims are still circulating a given air is not rooted in any real historic contestation of fact. It's purely rooted in political expediency, which makes it all the more disgusting because they know what the right thing to do is, but they are choosing not to do it for fear of what the reaction from Turkey will be. Well, if we say if denial of human rights abuses is a condition of friendship with Turkey, then the US shouldn't be friends with Turkey. Why would we allow that to take place? And not only that, Turkey's failure to reconcile with this history of genocide and the US's inability to hold it to account for its historic crimes against humanity transfers to this day, not only when it comes to the perpetration of crimes against our communities, but when it comes to the persecution of Kurds, or the fact that Turkey is to this day deporting Uyghurs to China to face certain persecution in China. They recently passed a law to do that. Or when they are bombing Yazidi genocide survivor refugee camps in Iraq's Sinjar region, or when they're going and perpetrating these airstrikes on Kurdish communities in Iraq, right? It's all connected to this pattern of genocide impunity that Turkey has benefited from for such a long, long time. And that is why there is not only a moral obligation to recognize the genocide for our community in order to ensure that we are allowed to mourn the lives that were lost and to ensure that we are able to have this just righteousness of recognition to start healing those wounds that our community have been denied the ability to mourn and denied that trauma, that experience of trauma for so long. It's also important for US policy. It's important for global security because a genocide denied is a genocide encouraged. And it doesn't matter if it's a genocide perpetrated by Turkey or by China or Myanmar or Pakistan or whoever it might be. Those genocides are all intrinsically connected through the same common thread of impunity that states have been afforded for their perpetration of genocide for so long. And if we don't call those things out when we see it to prevent them, then we only encourage their future perpetration. And that is unfortunately what we've seen time and time again when it comes to this issue of genocide and atrocity prevention. So recognition is not only important for us as a sort of solace, it's something that is an absolute political necessity, an absolute political and moral imperative that we feel all the more keenly because we see the continuation of those crimes from 106 years ago to today against our communities to this day. Sorry, I've taken up so much time.
No, please don't apologize. I feel like we could probably talk for 5 hours and everybody would want to listen because you've encapsulated so much, and so much of it is related to everything we've been talking about today. In fact, what you were just describing reminds me of something we kind of theorized. We call it the endogenous cycle of Hinduphobia. And essentially what it does is it makes it pro-social to be Hinduphobic, right? So it is that sort of justification or permission structure to deny, to gaslight, to erase, and to actually flip the entire thing around and map it back onto the people who were the victims and the descendants of survivors of genocide and persecution, and say, well, something is really wrong with you people. And in even speaking about your genocide, you're actually trying to perpetrate violence on other people, right? So the act of speaking the truth is then weaponized as a form of violence, because in fact, it is actually really threatening to all of the mechanisms that you've described that are put in place and held tightly in order to keep the reality or the fake reality in place in order to justify all of this gaslighting and all of this ignoring. There's so many layers to what you described too, because there's physical genocide as you described, there's the spiritual one that you described, and then of course all of this manipulation of facts and manipulation of psychology has an impact on the community. And in one of our conversations, you described, I had asked you about, what does the Armenian educational system look like? Which I think is very interesting because we know in India, the Indian educational system has baked into it a lot of the gaslighting and the justifications. And you gave me a really interesting response. I was wondering if you could just take a quick moment to talk about what happened to Armenian education.
Well, I mean, the history of the Armenian nation state is so just marred by these historic traumas, particularly Soviet occupation. And Soviet occupation in itself is very intrinsically linked to the history of genocide that our communities have experienced too, because it happened around the same time. And the process of partition of our country and occupation of our country by the Soviets, by the Bolsheviks, was very much taking advantage of a situation of a country that was left with this genocide, like the legacy of genocide that it was dealing with, a huge refugee crisis. Anyway, the way in which the Soviets dealt with Armenia and all of their constituent republics was to try and standardize identity, to try and create this homogenous concept of identity that has perpetuated, to this day, to the point at which Armenia was in many ways unprepared for independence when it got it in 1991. But the Armenian system of education is one where I think the experience of trauma is locked in, both through a direct kind of sense of the curriculum and the way in which people are taught, but also in the fact that it's an incredibly isolated country that doesn't really have the means to be able to invest in things like education, that there is a gap in education that is enforced as a result of the situation of the enduring legacy of genocide. So at a geopolitical level, 80% of Armenia's land borders are blockaded by Turkey and Azerbaijan. Armenia is a landlocked country, and Turkey does not provide any access to the sea. To our south is Iran, which is a close country culturally as well. I mean, my family are from Iran and lived there for hundreds of years, and there's a great cultural and political relationship too. But Iran is a pariah state as a result of the sanctions regime, which makes it not a particularly valuable or outlet to the world. And then Georgia to the north has trouble with Russia, and Russia is Armenia's major security guarantor. So in many ways, we're surrounded by ineffective blockaded borders that do not serve the Armenian security or economy very well. And that's really kind of sunk its way into the way in which the Armenian state is able to function. There's at this local level, at a schooling level, it's very difficult for resources to find their way into these systems outside of diasporan-funded education, which is very important. And I think it might actually be worth mentioning here as well. I should have mentioned it earlier, but Armenia is a country of 3 million people with a diaspora of 8 million people, 8 or 9 million people. So our diaspora outnumbers Armenia about threefold and takes on a lot of the burden of everything from political advocacy, which is an important part of ensuring the security and survival of the state, but also economic development. Our airport in Yerevan was funded by a diasporan. Most of our tourism industry has been funded by diasporans. These are all people who themselves have been displaced largely as a product of genocide, who still feel this great sense of need and urgency to invest in Armenia and ensure the survival of the state. But I think most tragically is just Armenia is an incredibly educated country. At a tertiary level, an incredibly educated country. 54% of the workforce, by some measures, have a higher education, tertiary education. When you compare it to other countries in the world, that's far higher than the average. And that was largely as a result of the Soviet standardized education system. When I was there in 2018, I was living with a local family, and my host family, my host mother, she was a physics professor at a Yerevan State University, an incredibly educated woman with PhDs and intrinsic knowledge of these complex issues, who found that it was more worthwhile for her to be a host mother for diasporans coming to Armenia because there was no work for her. And if there was work for her, it wouldn't pay anything because there's just no money going into the economy there. There's a serious brain drain situation. A lot of educated Armenians leave the country for Europe or the United States, and others in kind of more physical labor leave the country for Russia because there are better economic opportunities in Russia, to the point at which we've had constant population decline for the last 30 years. And you'd be fooling yourself to say that this wasn't a product of the legacy of genocide. Armenia is a genocide survivor state. And almost everything from our geopolitics to our economics to the way in which culture is manifested in that country is defined by these forces of genocide that happened 100 years ago. Not necessarily directly the result of genocide per se, but the atmosphere or the legacy of that genocide and what it has resulted at a political level in our borders, but also what it meant for the country being so susceptible to foreign intervention, interference, and destruction by the Soviets and other forces. It's a very dire situation. And since independence, there has been a really concerted effort to try and strengthen the security of the state and to ensure the security of our populations in places like Artsakh, that Armenian enclave that is recognized as part of Azerbaijan. But those genocidal forces from Turkey and Azerbaijan that persist to this day have sought to, at every turn, prevent Armenia from being able to flourish as a country, because there exists this ideology that we call pan-Turkism. I think they call pan-Turkism as well, pan-Turanism, which sees that there is this sort of geographically contiguous Turkic belt that stretches from Anatolia to Central Asia, and Armenia lies in the middle of that. And in order for the pan-Turkic aspiration to be realized, the Armenian state needs to disappear. And that has been a guiding force in Erdogan's policies in recent years, very overtly part of those policies in recent years. And that is something that has strongly affected the ability for our nation to thrive and survive on every front, whether it be education, whether it be at an economic level, at a political level. A great example of this is that, and the US also bears complicity in this, is that Azerbaijan is a very wealthy oil state. That is why Azerbaijan's side is often taken by the international community. It's a very common story for many countries in the region. A pipeline was built from Azerbaijan to Turkey with the support of many US companies and the backing of the US government that deliberately bypassed Armenia, even though it would have made more sense to go through Armenia because of the distance that it had to travel to bypass Armenia. But still, the intention was to economically isolate Armenia in every respect. And those sorts of policies persist. There was even, of course, when the Trump administration broke from the JCPOA with Iran, National Security Advisor Bolton went to Armenia and threatened Armenia with sanctions should it not close its border with Iran, which would have been devastating for Armenia because Iran is one of the only open borders we have. And that trade is important for what we have left as a country. These sorts of pressures exist. At a political level, this failure to take into account the history of genocide and how it affects the Armenian state today is what has informed a lot of very, very bad policies towards the region. What has allowed Turkey to get away with what it's been doing for so long, allowed the world to kind of get away with this blissful ignorance of the perpetration of violence by the Turkish regime, even though we've seen it, not just in the last couple of years, as the US foreign policy elite have slowly started to wake up to the fact that Turkey may be a very belligerent bad actor in the region. We've been seeing the same thing taking place since 1915. And the kind of, to go to that point about gaslighting experience, we speak, no one listens. And we've been warning about these things for many, many years. No one listens. It's only until it reaches the dire point at which Turkey is on the brink of perpetrating another genocide against the Kurds that suddenly the international community thinks, oh, maybe we should pay attention to this. Maybe there's a dimension of continuity here that we should be concerned about. And that's what makes the recognition tomorrow, or hopefully is poised to be recognition tomorrow, very, very significant. And adds a lot of weight to that, because it's not just about historic crimes. It's also has a direct bearing on the contemporary situation in Armenia. And that's why we as an organization, while we're going to welcome this decision, we are very, very conscious of the fact that this process continues and that recognition needs to inform policy. It's not enough that you make a rhetorical gesture or statement towards recognition. And this, I think, is something that applies to every single case of genocide, is that if you recognize the historic injustice, you also need to recognize the effects and impact of that historic injustice and how it's affected the victims and survivors of that crime, and amend your policies to that region, that country, to reflect that newfound enlightenment about what has happened, and try to act in some form of restitution to support those communities that have suffered as a result of the impunity that the United States, amongst other countries, has allowed to continue for this long. Sorry, I know I kind of went on a tangent a little bit there, but
No.
I think it kind of speaks to the point that all of these phenomena are interconnected, that the legacy of genocide is not singular. It, in fact, stretches through every sort of, permeates every aspect of society. And then at a macro level, also permeates between all the other cases of genocide that exist in the world today, that these are all interconnected phenomenon cases that, I mean, I really do believe that recognition of the Armenian genocide is an important precedent that needs to be established in order for us to really start to face the fact that these other cases of genocide have occurred, and we need to really begin the path now to recognize those. But the Armenian genocide has been described as the first modern genocide in history. It served as the blueprint of the Genocide Convention, and that sort of original sin is one that needs to be confessed. It's because the entire international community suffers as a result of its continued denial, not just because of the Armenians and what we suffer, but because of what that has meant at an international level, at a policy level for the United States. That to have a country like the United States to say that we will happily allow our human rights to take a backseat to our geopolitical interests is a very dangerous thing to say in a world full of very manipulative, malign forces that would more than readily follow that example and have.
Yeah. Alex, we could literally talk for 3 hours about this, we have talked for hours before. And I just want to thank you so much. I mean, your articulation of so many complex dynamics and how they all work together, it's just, it's so powerful. And the two words that really come to mind for me that you spoke were survival and thriving. And I think they're both really important. I think oftentimes people don't want to associate with sort of like a victimhood narrative, but what comes through in the story you've shared about your own life and the Armenian community is that it's about survival. And if you've survived, that means you've survived something. So you have a story to tell that people need to hear. People don't survive nothing. And so that something needs to be stated and acknowledged and recognized and validated. And then just the right to thrive, which I see is completely tied in with that recognition that you can't thrive until people recognize what you've survived, because it sits with you at a deep level. Unfortunately, we do have to move on to there. Happily, we get to move on also. But I want to thank you so much for taking the time. We, as a whole community, wish your community all the best. Hopefully that this announcement comes through tomorrow. And I know that tomorrow is a heavy day, even if it ends up being a somewhat positive direction for you. So our hearts are with you. And we just hope to keep this dialogue going as we move forward.
Thank you so much for your thoughts, and we do truly appreciate it. And absolutely, I think these bridges of solidarity are those that we need to continue cultivating and building, and for whatever we can do to exchange ideas and values and experiences to help amplify our cause against these forces of genocide and persecution and Hinduphobia, Armenophobia, dehumanization, whatever it might be. We need to continue this conversation, keep this dialogue going, and I will always be here as a resource to the Hindu American community whenever you need. I would love to continue this conversation with each and every one of you here. So thank you so much for the opportunity. I'm truly humbled and honored to be able to speak with you all today. And thank you for the invitation.
Thank you so much, Alex.
For the latest on our YouTube channel, click subscribe and hit the bell icon for alerts on new content. Remember to like, comment, and share our videos. For more about HSC, you can visit the social media handles listed below.